I sat at the far end of the soundproof mahogany conference table, staring directly into the eyes of the woman who had spent 19 years lying to my face. The room was deathly quiet, the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that settles over a room right before an explosion. The overhead air vents hummed faintly, but all I could hear was the steady, deliberate pounding of my own heart. My beloved wife had been in the cold ground for barely 72 hours, and already the vultures were ripping at the edges of my life. My daughter-in-law, Eleanor, slammed a thick, leather-bound binder onto the polished table, the sharp, thunderous crack echoing off the glass walls. She did not look like a grieving relative. She looked like a triumphant predator standing over a cornered, exhausted old man. She leaned across the wood, her diamond rings catching the fluorescent lights, a cruel, mocking smile spreading across her face. "Now that Helena is dead and buried," she said, her voice dropping into a low, vicious rasp, "you will sign over Thorne heavy infrastructure to my son and get out of our way. You are useless now, Gabriel. Your time is officially up." I looked past her to my son, Gregory, sitting right beside her. He was staring intensely at his expensive gold wristwatch, his broad shoulders hunched, far too much of a coward to meet his father's eyes. They genuinely believed they had backed a broken, 70-year-old widower into a trap. They thought grief had made me weak, blind, and helpless, but they had completely forgotten who built the $65 million empire they were trying to steal. I did not raise my voice. I did not slam my fist on the table. I simply leaned back, folded my hands over my chest, and waited. Exactly 3 seconds later, the heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open. My legal counsel, Harrison Cross, walked straight into the room without saying a single word. He walked to the head of the table and slapped a certified, sealed genetic laboratory report directly in front of Eleanor's manicured hands. To understand how we ended up in that icy boardroom, you have to go back exactly 3 days. The suffocating scent of funeral lilies still clung heavy to the curtains of my home. Helena was gone. 44 years of an unbreakable marriage shattered in less than 4 months by an aggressive stomach cancer that tore her away from me bit by bit. The sprawling house felt unnaturally vast, empty in a way that made my chest physically ache every time I took a breath. I stood alone in the kitchen at 6 p.m, letting warm tap water run over my trembling hands as I washed a simple glass mug. It was a mindless, repetitive task, anything to stop my eyes from wandering toward the empty armchair in the living room where she used to read her morning books. That was when I heard the sharp, rhythmic clicking of high heels marching down the hardwood hallway. I turned off the faucet, dried my hands on a cloth, and turned around. Eleanor walked into the kitchen. There was not a single tear in her eyes. Her face was immaculately painted, her sharp black designer suit pristine, looking far more like an executive attending a hostile corporate buyout than a daughter-in-law honoring a deceased matriarch. She did not ask how I was holding up. She did not offer a single word of comfort. She simply tossed a thick manila folder onto the granite counter right next to my drying rack. Printed across the top page in bold red letters were the words, "Executive Power Delegation" and "Irrevocable Asset Transfer." I looked at the paper, then lifted my eyes to Eleanor. "What is this, Eleanor?" I asked, keeping my voice low and steady. She let out a dramatic, irritated sigh, crossing her arms over her chest, as if she were dealing with a stubborn, slow-witted child. "It is common sense, Gabriel," she said smoothly, resting her hip against the island. "You are 70 years old. You just buried your wife. You are grieving, confused, and physically unfit to oversee a heavy equipment enterprise right now. You need to sign this transfer today so we can put executive control into Zachary's trust before the market reacts to Helena's death." Zachary was my 18-year-old grandson, a boy who had barely scraped through his senior year of private high school and spent 90% of his waking hours racing luxury sports cars through suburban neighborhoods and posting videos on social media. I stared at the legal folder, feeling a cold, stone-hard knot form in the pit of my stomach. Thorne Heavy Infrastructure was not just a company to me. It was the physical monument of my sweat, my blood, and my youth. Helena and I built that company from a single leased excavator back in 1984. We had no rich investors funding our dreams. We lived on cold, canned beans in the back of an old pickup truck, battling freezing winters and ruthless competitors to win our very first municipal pipeline contracts. Helena managed the financial ledgers on an inverted plastic crate, while I worked 16-hour shifts operating heavy machinery until my hands bled inside my leather gloves. And now, barely 3 days after shoveling dirt over my wife's casket, this woman was demanding I hand the key to a spoiled teenager so she could pull the strings from the shadows. I did not scream. I did not display my rage. In business, the moment you display explosive emotion is the exact moment you hand your opponent the advantage. I looked her in the eyes and said, "The company is operating smoothly. I am grieving Eleanor, but I am not brain dead." Right on cue, my son Gregory stepped through the kitchen door. He was 42 years old, yet standing next to his overbearing wife, he looked like a terrified schoolboy waiting for instructions. He walked over and placed a soft, sweating hand on my shoulder, putting on a highly rehearsed performance of filial devotion. "Dad, please, just listen to her," Gregory murmured, his voice trembling slightly. "The doctor told us your blood pressure has been dangerously high all month. We are genuinely terrified about your health. We cannot afford to lose you too. Just sign the agreement. Let Zachary hold the title in the Bloodline Trust, and Eleanor and I will handle the daily grind at the yards. You can retire to the lake house. You do not have to worry about another contract, another labor union, or another financial audit ever again." It sounded so exceptionally sweet. It was the perfect, plausible lie. A caring son and a protective daughter-in-law stepping up to lift a crushing burden from an aging man's tired shoulders. But I knew my son better than he knew himself. I had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars sending him to elite private institutions, hoping to forge him into a strong leader, only to watch him become a passive, spineless man who could not order a cup of coffee without checking his wife's face for permission first. I looked at the sleek silver fountain pen Eleanor had placed beside the folder. "I will review the clauses," I said quietly, stepping back from the island. "I do not sign documents without my legal counsel reading every single word." Gregory nodded quickly, eager to escape the tension hanging in the room. "Of course, Dad, take your time," he said with a nervous smile. "Just do not delay too long. The board is anxious." They turned around and walked out of the kitchen, their footsteps fading toward the front foyer. I stood frozen by the counter, my heart beating a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. I turned my head toward the tall glass patio doors facing the long hallway mirror. The evening shadows rendered the glass a perfect, dark reflection. In that dark reflection, I saw Eleanor pause near the front door. She pulled her phone from her purse and began typing rapidly. She had no idea I could see her reflection perfectly from where I stood. I watched as her thumb flew across the screen. As she hit the send button, a sharp, triumphant smirk broke across her face, and she whispered 5 words under her breath that chilled my blood. "The old fool is swallowing it." I stood alone in my quiet kitchen, the tap dripping once every 4 seconds. They honestly believed I was an incompetent, broken old widower who would quietly surrender his life's work. They thought they had backed me into a corner in my own home, but they were about to learn a brutal truth. An old wolf might be gray, but his teeth are just as sharp, and I was about to bite down hard. By 5 o'clock the following morning, I was pulling my truck into the primary equipment yard of Thorne Heavy Infrastructure. The crisp autumn air felt sharp against my face as I walked toward the concrete headquarters. I needed the familiar scent of diesel fuel, hydraulic oil, and iron to clear the fog from my mind. I passed through the security gate, nodding to the night shift guard, and took the stairs directly to the executive archive room at the end of the second-floor hallway. The archives held the physical master deeds, trust origin documents, and digital backup drives for every transaction since 1985. If Eleanor and Gregory were attempting a corporate takeover, they would need to alter the core articles of incorporation. I reached the heavy steel door, pulled my master biometric keycard from my coat, and swiped it across the digital scanner. Instead of the familiar green flash and mechanical click, the scanner emitted a harsh, double electronic beep. A solid red light glowed on the panel. Access denied. I stared at the digital pad. My card was the master authorization. It was programmed never to expire under any circumstances. I swiped it again. Red light. Access denied. I tried a third time, holding the card firmly against the glass. Red light. Access completely revoked. "Having a little trouble with the system, Gabriel?" A voice called out from the darkness near the corner break room. I turned around slowly. Stepping into the overhead fluorescent light was Lyle Vance, our chief financial officer. He was 46 years old, dressed in a custom three-piece suit, exuding a suffocating cloud of expensive sandalwood cologne. He walked toward me holding a paper cup of coffee, a slick, practiced smile plastered across his face. He looked entirely too alert for 5 a.m. "Lyle," I said, keeping my posture rigid and my voice flat. "My master clearance card is being rejected by the executive archives." Lyle stopped 3 feet away, taking a slow sip from his cup. "Ah, yes," he said smoothly, his eyes crinkling with artificial sympathy. "I forgot to drop a memo on your desk. Gregory ordered a complete overhaul of our digital security protocols late last night. He felt that given your sudden leave of absence to process Helena's passing, we needed to tighten asset security against potential cyber threats. The system has temporarily restricted administrative clearances while the IT contractors migrate the core databases." "Gregory ordered it?" I repeated slowly, letting the name hang in the cold air between us. Lyle nodded, entirely unbothered. "Indeed. Gregory felt it was time he took the initiative. You really should not be worrying yourself with corporate security right now, Gabriel. Go back home. Rest. Let the younger generation handle the stress." I looked into Lyle Vance's eyes. They were cold, calculating, and full of hidden arrogance. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew that I saw through the lie. They were locking me out of my own servers. They were creating a digital perimeter around the financial records while using my cowardly son as the figurehead. The younger version of me would have grabbed Lyle by his silk tie and put him through the drywall. But decades in high-stakes commercial construction had taught me a vital lesson. When your enemy believes they have successfully ambushed you, you do not interrupt their victory celebration until your counterattack is fully loaded. "I am glad to see Gregory showing some backbone," I said calmly, forcing a faint nod. "Tell him I appreciate his concern for our data." I turned around and walked back toward the main exit. I could feel Lyle's triumphant stare burning into my back the entire way down the corridor, but I did not break my stride. I got into my truck and locked the cab. They thought revoking my key card rendered me blind. They assumed that because they controlled the physical server room, they held all the cards. But they had forgotten one fundamental detail. 10 years ago, during an aggressive corporate espionage attempt by an out-of-state competitor, I had hired an elite off-the-grid programmer to build an invisible, hardware-level backdoor directly into the motherboard of the main server. It was accessible through a single, heavily encrypted portable hard drive that never left my possession. I pulled the small black drive from the secret zippered compartment of my leather jacket. I booted up my personal laptop, connected the drive, and began typing the 32-character alphanumeric code. My screen flashed black, then filled with lines of cascading green text. I was inside the system, hovering beneath their new security protocols like a ghost. My fingers hovered over the keys, ready to dive into the financial ledgers to see what Lyle Vance was hiding. But before I could press the enter key, my mobile phone vibrated violently against the dashboard, shattering the quiet inside the cab. I glanced at the caller identification. It was the emergency desk at St. Jude Regional Hospital. I answered immediately, lifting the phone to my ear. "Is this Gabriel Thorne?" a tense female voice asked. "Speaking," I replied. "Mr. Thorne, this is the trauma intake department," she said rapidly. "Your grandson, Zachary Thorne, was just brought in by ambulance following a severe motor vehicle collision on the highway. He is currently in critical condition in the emergency room. We need his immediate family present right now." I slammed my laptop shut, shoved the drive back into my jacket, and threw the truck into drive. The digital investigation was instantly put on hold. Regardless of Eleanor's greed or my son's cowardice, Zachary was still a child I had carried on my shoulders. He was the boy who sat on my lap in the excavator cab when he was 5 years old, giggling as we moved piles of dirt. I sped through the city streets, running yellow lights, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my chest. I abandoned my truck in the ambulance loading bay, ignoring the warning shouts of a parking attendant, and burst through the sliding doors of the emergency wing. The smell of cold disinfectant and rubbing alcohol hit my nose immediately. I spotted them down the hall. Eleanor was pacing near the triage desk, furiously tapping on her smartphone screen, looking far more annoyed by the inconvenience than distraught. Gregory was slumped on a plastic bench, his head in his hands, his body trembling violently. "What happened?" I demanded, rushing up to them, my heavy boots thumping against the floor. Gregory looked up, his eyes bloodshot and swollen. He lost control of his car on the wet expressway. Gregory choked out, wiping his face with a crumpled handkerchief. He took a corner at 90 miles an hour and flipped into the steel barrier. He has a cracked collarbone, severe lacerations on his legs, and internal bleeding near his spleen. He lost massive amounts of blood before the paramedics pulled him from the wreckage. Eleanor snapped her phone shut and glared at me. "It is an absolute nightmare," she hissed loudly. "We had the board meeting scheduled for 2 o'clock today to finalize the transition, and now we are stuck in this filthy waiting room." I stared at her, completely disgusted by her absolute lack of motherly instincts. Her son was lying on a gurney behind double steel doors, and her primary frustration was a delayed corporate takeover. Before I could speak, the double doors swung open, and an exhausted trauma surgeon stepped into the hallway. He pulled down his blue surgical mask, his brow furrowed with deep anxiety. "Family of Zachary Thorne?" he called out. We stepped forward as one. "He is stable for the moment," the surgeon said, holding a chart. "We have contained the internal bleeding near his spleen, but his overall blood volume is dangerously depleted. He needs an immediate, large-scale blood transfusion to prevent his organs from slipping into catastrophic shock." "Then give him the blood," Eleanor demanded sharply, stepping toward the doctor. "What are you waiting for? We have premium health insurance." The surgeon raised his hand to quiet her. "Madam, it is not an issue of insurance," he said sternly. "Your son has an exceptionally rare blood group. He is B positive. Under normal conditions, we would pull from our regional bank, but a massive pileup on the interstate 2 hours ago depleted our entire local reserve of B positive and universal donor supplies. We are waiting on a transport helicopter from the state capital, but it is delayed by heavy fog. We need an immediate, direct donor from a biological parent to bridge the gap right now." The hallway suddenly felt icy cold. The rhythmic sound of hospital monitors faded into a quiet hum in my ears. The surgeon's words repeated in my head over and over, striking my brain like a sledgehammer. B positive. Zachary is B positive. My mind, rigorously trained over 40 years to analyze complex technical specifications and spot structural flaws, immediately locked onto an absolute, unbreakable law of human biology. I am O negative. My late wife, Helena, was O negative. 2 biological parents with O negative blood can only ever, under any scientific circumstance, produce a child with O negative blood. My son Gregory was verified O negative when he underwent emergency knee surgery as a teenager. I knew his medical history by heart. Eleanor, I recalled from an insurance application years ago, was A positive. An O negative parent and an A positive parent can produce an A-type child or an O-type child. They can never, ever produce a child with B-type blood. The dominant B allele had to come from a biological father who carried the B genetic marker. Gregory did not carry it. I did not carry it. Helena did not carry it. I stood completely paralyzed in the sterile corridor, staring at the white wall behind the surgeon. The undeniable biological math screamed in my head. The boy bleeding on the operating table, the grandson I had doted on, spoiled, and spent 18 years preparing to inherit my $65 million heavy equipment empire, did not have a single drop of Thorne blood in his body. He was not my biological grandson. I slowly turned my head to look at Eleanor. She was screaming at the doctor, aggressively threatening to sue the hospital, demanding they fly blood in from another state, doing everything in her power to create a loud, chaotic scene to mask the fact that she could not step forward to donate her own blood without opening a dangerous biological investigation. Then I looked at my son. I expected to see Gregory looking confused. I expected him to ask the doctor about a potential lab error or a mix-up in blood typing, but Gregory was backed firmly against the wall, clutching the handrail until his knuckles turned ghostly white. He was sweating profusely, his face pale as a sheet. He was not looking at the doctor. He was staring straight down at the linoleum floor, his whole frame shivering. He was not confused. He was terrified. He knew. He absolutely knew the biological math did not add up. When he finally lifted his eyes, he caught me staring at him. For 3 agonizing seconds, our eyes locked across the hallway.
He saw the cold, sharp realization settle onto my face. He saw that I had worked out the truth. Gregory instantly snapped his head away, completely unable to face me. The immediate crisis was resolved 20 minutes later when the medical transport helicopter managed to land through the fog, delivering the necessary B-positive blood units.
Zachary received the transfusion, his vitals stabilized, and the surgeon confirmed he would make a full physical recovery. Eleanor immediately took charge of the paperwork, arranging for Zachary to be transferred to a high-end private recovery suite once he was brought out of the post-operation unit. An unbearable, suffocating atmosphere hung over us in the waiting area. We were no longer a family waiting on a medical update. We were three people standing on top of a massive structure of calculated lies that had just suffered a fatal structural crack. I did not confront them in the hospital hallway. Exposing your knowledge prematurely in an uncontrolled environment is an amateur mistake. Instead, I calmly suggested to Gregory that we go down to the hospital cafeteria to grab a cup of black coffee while we waited for Zachary to wake up. Gregory hesitated, casting a desperate glance at Eleanor, but she was entirely absorbed in arguing with an insurance representative on her phone and waved him off. Gregory swallowed hard, nodded meekly, and followed me to the elevator. The basement cafeteria was dimly lit, smelling faintly of burnt coffee and harsh chemical cleaner. We sat at a small round table in the back corner, completely away from the few nurses eating late meals. Gregory sat with his hands wrapped tightly around a paper cup, staring down into the dark liquid as if it held the answers to his life. I took a slow sip of my coffee, set the cup down, and rested my forearms on the table. "That was an intense situation upstairs," I said quietly, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. "We are fortunate the helicopter made it through the fog. But I have to admit, Gregory, the doctor's biological statements raised a curious question in my mind. He noted that Zachary is B-positive. Your mother and I were both O-negative. You are O-negative. Eleanor is A-positive. How exactly does a child born to an O-negative father and an A-positive mother end up with B-positive blood?" Gregory flinched violently, spilling a splash of hot coffee over his knuckles. The sweat returned to his forehead in thick, glistening beads. He did not look at me with genuine confusion. He did not suggest a clerical error or a hospital mix-up. Instead, he exploded with immediate defensive aggression. "You are being paranoid, Dad!" he hissed loudly, his voice cracking with high-pitched anger. "The hospital made a clerical mistake on the chart. It happens all the time in hectic emergency rooms. My son is lying in an intensive care bed, and you are sitting here trying to construct some insane, insulting conspiracy theory because you are grieving and out of your mind." I sat perfectly still, absorbing his angry outburst. In 40 years of running a heavy construction firm, I had sat across from dozens of subcontractors, suppliers, and union reps who were trying to cover up stolen materials or breached contracts. I knew what genuine innocence looked like. And I knew what a guilty, cornered man looked like when his lies were crumbling around him. Gregory was a terrible liar. If he genuinely believed it was a clerical error, he would have expressed mild annoyance or promised to double-check the records later. But he attacked me. He tried to use my grief over Helena as a weapon to shut down a basic biological question. Sitting across from him, a deep, profound sadness washed over me. This was my son, the boy I had worked 18-hour days to provide for. While Helena and I were sleeping in the cab of our old truck, saving every penny to build Thorne infrastructure, we dreamed of giving this boy a life of security and pride. We paid for his elite private schools, his summer camps, his expensive European trips, and his Ivy League tuition. We gave him every single advantage we had been denied, hoping to mold a strong, capable leader who would carry our name into the next generation. But all that money and privilege had produced a weak, cowardly follower who was completely devoid of an internal spine. He had returned from college not as a leader, but as a man who always capitulated to the dominant personality in the room. And unfortunately, the dominant personality in his life was Eleanor. She had recognized his weakness early on and had spent 20 years manipulating him into a compliant accessory to her own grand ambitions. "You are probably right, Gregory," I said softly, my voice dropping to a chill that made him freeze. "It must simply be a clerical error. After all, what other logical explanation could there possibly be?" Gregory swallowed hard, his throat making a sharp clicking sound. He quickly turned his head away, completely unable to meet my eyes. He mumbled an incoherent agreement, staring blindly at the floor. He knew that I knew. I stood up from the table, leaving my half-empty coffee cup behind. "Stay here and compose yourself," I said quietly. "I am going back upstairs." I rode the elevator back to the recovery floor. My mind was no longer processing grief. It was running tactical calculations. I needed undisputed, legally ironclad proof of the genetic betrayal, and I needed it before Eleanor realized I was actively collecting evidence. I went home, packed a small leather bag with 3 sterile plastic specimen bags, a pair of surgical latex gloves, and 2 sets of sterile collection swabs I pulled from my home first aid kit. I cooked a large pot of homemade vegetable soup, placed it in glass containers, and drove straight to Gregory and Eleanor's sprawling suburban estate at 8 o'clock that evening.
Gregory opened the front door, looking completely exhausted.
"Dad?" he asked, surprised. "You did not have to come out here." "I brought some warm food for you and Eleanor," I said, offering a warm, tired smile. "I know you have both had a taxing day." Gregory stepped aside, letting me into the foyer. Eleanor was sitting at the kitchen island, drinking a glass of red wine while reviewing documents on her tablet. She barely looked up as I set the glass containers on the counter. I offered to go upstairs to check on Zachary, who had been discharged late that afternoon and was resting in his bedroom. Eleanor waved her hand dismissively, completely unconcerned. "He is asleep," she said coldly. "Do not wake him up." I walked up the carpeted staircase, keeping my footsteps entirely silent. Zachary's bedroom door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open gently. The boy was fast asleep, propped up on heavy pillows, a pair of black wireless headphones resting over his ears. I stepped past his bed and slipped quietly into his attached private bathroom. I pulled the latex gloves onto my hands. I opened the mirrored medicine cabinet above the sink. Resting in a ceramic cup was his blue electric toothbrush, the bristles damp from his evening routine. It was a pristine, uncontaminated source of biological material. I carefully placed the toothbrush into the first sterile plastic bag, sealed it tight, and slipped it into my jacket pocket. I peeled off the gloves, stepped out of the bathroom, and walked silently down the hall. But I did not head back to the kitchen. I turned into the laundry room located near the back stairs. Gregory was a creature of strict, lazy habit. Every evening after returning from his private golf club or gym, he dropped his worn athletic wear into a woven hamper beside the laundry sink. I put on a fresh pair of latex gloves and opened the hamper. Resting on top was his dark gray sweatband and athletic shirt from his morning workout. I lifted the shirt under the bright overhead light. Trapped near the collar were 4 distinct strands of dark hair with intact root follicles. I pulled a pair of small tweezers from my pocket, carefully extracted the hair strands, and dropped them into the second sterile plastic bag. I sealed the bag, put my tools away, and walked back downstairs. I stayed in the kitchen for another 10 minutes, playing the part of a comforting, tired grandfather before excusing myself. I drove through the night to an expedited private genetics laboratory located in the neighboring industrial park. I had arranged an after-hours emergency intake through an executive contact. I handed the sealed plastic bags to the technician, along with a $4,000 cash fee for a priority 24-hour DNA match test. As I walked out of the lab into the cold night air, my phone buzzed. It was an automated security alert from my laptop. Someone inside Thorne Infrastructure was attempting to execute an emergency wire transfer of $6,800,000 from our Master Capital Reserve Fund, and they were attempting to use my spoofed digital signature to authorize it. I sped back to my house, my jaw clenched tightly. I did not go to the corporate office. Confronting them at the terminal would only allow Lyle Vance to delete the access logs and claim it was a system error. I locked myself inside my home office, booted up my laptop, and accessed the invisible back door I had built into the corporate server years ago. Lines of green code flooded my screen. I was looking directly at Lyle Vance's terminal in real time. He was sitting in his office at 1 a.m, frantically typing commands, attempting to force the $6,800,000 transfer past the secondary authorization checks. He was using a forged digital certificate built from a scanned copy of my personal signature. With a few swift keystrokes, I executed an administrative freeze on the transaction, trapping the money in a digital holding vault. Lyle's terminal would show the transfer as pending system verification, keeping him completely unaware that his theft had been blocked. Then, I began diving deep into the corporate ledgers, pulling records that Lyle believed he had permanently deleted from the primary database. What I uncovered was a massive, systematic parasite that had been draining Thorne heavy infrastructure for over 18 months. Lyle had created 5 dummy shell corporations registered in Delaware under obscure names: Apex Machinery Leasing, Horizon Consulting, Vanguard Logistics, Meridian Equipment Supplies, and Sterling Global Operations. Over the past year and a half, millions of dollars had been funneled into these accounts through fake invoices for non-existent equipment parts, fabricated maintenance contracts, and inflated fuel surcharges. But the most horrifying discovery came when I cross-referenced the source of the stolen funds. The money was not coming from our corporate profits or operational reserves. Lyle Vance and Eleanor had been systematically draining the Employee Disability and Pension Trust Fund, the retirement safety net for over 300 heavy equipment operators, mechanics, and site workers who had dedicated their lives to my company. And the timeline was sickening. The very first massive withdrawal was executed 18 months ago, the exact week my late wife Helena received her terminal cancer diagnosis. While I was sitting in hospital rooms holding Helena's hand, watching her fade away, my daughter-in-law and my CFO were robbing my workers blind. They knew I was entirely consumed by grief and medical decisions. They had weaponized my wife's terminal illness, using my pain as a shield to execute their crime. I sat back in my chair, staring at the glowing screen, the puzzle pieces locked together with absolute clarity. The $6,800,000 theft, the fake Delaware LLCs, the sudden push to force me out of the company, and the emergency handover document Eleanor had tossed onto my kitchen counter. The handover agreement was not just about taking control of the company. Buried in the fine print at the back of the document was a full legal indemnification clause, absolving the incoming executive board of all prior financial discrepancies, alongside a mandatory authorization for the upcoming annual audit bearing my signature as the sole approving party. The annual audit was scheduled in less than 2 weeks. When the independent auditors discovered the massive hole in the worker pension fund, they would look at the authorization logs. They would see my digital signature approving the transactions, and my signature on the handover document accepting full personal liability. They were not just stealing my company. They were meticulously setting me up to take the fall for a massive federal crime. They intended to send me to a federal prison for the rest of my life while they walked away with tens of millions of dollars. At 9 o'clock the following evening, my private burner phone rang. It was the director of the genetics laboratory. "Mr. Thorne," the director said, his voice flat and professional, "we have completed the priority DNA analysis on the biological samples you submitted. The results are absolute. The subject known as Zachary shares 0 paternal genetic markers with the subject known as Gregory. The probability of paternity is 0.00%. Furthermore, we cross-reference the secondary marker profiles as requested. The paternal markers of the boy match a secondary profile in our private database with a 99.9% statistical probability. The biological father of Zachary is Lyle Vance." The phone felt heavy in my hand. Lyle Vance, my CFO. The man Eleanor had convinced me to hire 9 years ago. The truth hit me like an avalanche. Eleanor and Lyle Vance had not simply started an affair. They were college sweethearts who had engineered a multi-decade-long con. They had planted Lyle inside my company, placed his child in my family, and spent 19 years waiting for the right moment to strip my life's work down to the bone. I spent the next morning sitting in the utilitarian office of Vince Callahan, a former federal investigator turned private intelligence operative. I placed a signed blank check on his desk. "I want everything," I said coldly. "Every account, every message, every secret meeting between Eleanor, Lyle Vance, and my son." 3 hours later, Callahan handed me a thick brown folder. Inside were bank statements, private hotel registries, and photos spanning 15 years documenting Eleanor and Lyle's continuous relationship. But the absolute deadliest document was trapped at the very bottom of the folder. It was a printed copy of an encrypted email sent 10 years ago from Gregory to Eleanor. I read the words, my hands steady, my heart turning to ice. "Eleanor," the email read. "The specialist confirmed it today. The adolescent mumps infection destroyed my reproductive capacity entirely. I am completely sterile. There is 0 chance I will ever father a child. We have to keep this completely quiet. If my mother finds out, She will trigger the biological lineage clause in the family trust and cut me off completely. We will present Zachary as my biological son. My parents must never know the truth. Gregory knew. He had known for a decade. He knew Zachary was not his blood, and he actively participated in the lie because he was terrified of losing his multi-million-dollar inheritance. He had sold his mother's sacred trust, his father's honor, and his own dignity for an allowance. He was not a victim of Eleanor's manipulation. He was an active, pathetic accomplice in a multi-decade fraud against his own parents. I packed the folder into my leather briefcase. The sorrow was entirely gone now. It was replaced by a cold, absolute, and terrifying clarity. I drove back to my house, staged my study with dark lighting and photos of Helena, and called Gregory. I told him in a weak, trembling, tearful voice that I was exhausted, that the grief was breaking me, and that I was ready to sign over the company. I invited them to present the final handover documents at the Friday morning board meeting. Gregory wept with relief on the phone, completely taking the bait. As soon as I hung up, the broken old man vanished. I stood up straight, called my attorney Harrison Cross, and alerted Special Agent Miller at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. On Friday morning, I dressed in my sharpest charcoal gray bespoke suit, fastened my platinum cufflinks, and pinned Helena's golden lapel pin to my jacket. I walked into the primary boardroom of Thorne Heavy Infrastructure at 8:55. The room was packed with board members, executives, and security guards. Eleanor sat at the head of the mahogany table, occupying my chair, radiating arrogant triumph. Gregory sat to her right, sweating heavily. Lyle Vance sat to her left, wearing a victorious grin. The handover documents were slid down the table to me alongside a heavy gold pen. "Now that Helena is dead and buried," Eleanor announced loudly, her voice filled with venom, "you will sign over Thorne Heavy Infrastructure to my son and get out of our way. You are useless now, Gabriel. Your time is officially up." I looked at the pen. I looked at my cowardly son, giving him one final silent chance to speak up, to be a man. Gregory looked away, staring down at his expensive shoes. I opened my hand and dropped the gold pin onto the table with a sharp clatter. "No," I said softly. Before Eleanor could react, the boardroom doors flew open. Harrison Cross walked in, followed by 4 armed federal agents. Harrison slapped the sealed DNA report onto the table. "The probability of paternity for Zachary is 0.00%, Harrison declared loudly. "The boy is the biological son of Lyle Vance. Under the strict biological bloodline clauses established by the late Helena Thorne, the succession agreement is completely null and void. You have 0 legal authority in this firm." The room exploded into absolute chaos. Zachary, sitting at the edge of the table, turned ghostly white, staring at his mother in complete horror. Eleanor's triumphant smile shattered into a hideous mask of screaming rage. Lyle Vance bolted from his seat, attempting to rush toward the private exit, but 2 federal agents slammed him against the glass wall, pulling his arms behind his back and ratcheting heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. I stood up, pulled the 10-year-old email from my briefcase, and tossed it directly at Gregory's chest. "You knew," I said, my voice cutting through the noise like an iron blade. "You knew you were sterile, and you helped them rob your own mother while she was dying in a hospital bed." Gregory looked at the email, collapsed back into his chair, and began sobbing hysterically, burying his face in his trembling hands. Eleanor screamed at Lyle, calling him an incompetent fool, while Lyle shouted back, accusing her of ruining the plan with her desperate greed. The federal agents seized Eleanor, securing her wrists in steel cuffs as she thrashed violently, screaming that she was owed half the empire. I watched them being dragged out of the boardroom in chains, my face an impenetrable mask of stone. I turned to my weeping son, dropped a 24-hour eviction notice onto his lap, and stripped him of his corporate title, his salary, and his entire inheritance. "You are evicted, you are fired, and you no longer exist to me," I told him calmly before walking away. I met with 18-year-old Zachary privately, offering to cover his college tuition for exactly 12 months so he could find his own footing in the world, making it crystal clear that after 1 year, he was entirely on his own. 6 months later, the federal court delivered its final verdict. Eleanor and Lyle Vance were both sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for grand wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. Gregory ended up living in a tiny, dilapidated studio apartment, working the graveyard shift as a shelf stocker at a local hardware store, earning minimum wage to pay for his basic groceries. I recovered the stolen $6,800,000 from frozen offshore accounts, fully restoring the worker pension fund. I rehired all the loyal executives who had been fired, bringing back my old team to rebuild the company's foundation. Then, standing on the rooftop of our corporate headquarters overlooking the bustling city, I signed the final documents for a brand new, unbreakable corporate structure. 50% of my entire fortune was permanently transferred into the Helena Thorne Foundation, funding full college scholarships for underprivileged youth who possessed real drive and integrity. The remaining 50% was placed into an employee stock ownership trust, placing the true ownership of Thorne heavy infrastructure directly into the hands of the mechanics, operators, and site workers who had actually bled to build it alongside me. Family is not defined by a shared surname, and it is certainly not defined by a marriage certificate. It is defined by absolute, unwavering loyalty. An old wolf might lose his mate, but he never loses his teeth. And when the time came, I bit back until there was nothing left of my enemies.